Hey everybody, welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hi, it's me, Jackie.
And it's me, Diana. Hello.
Well, folks, you know, I usually do a joke to start the show, so you're not quite sure what podcast you're listening to, but
Joke
I'm not
is
going
in loose
to.
Quotes.
In loose, you know, it's a metaphorical joke. But I'm going to get right to it on this podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, in which every week we pick a topic related to the field and we discuss it at length in some relevant research. So this week, I'm just going to get right to the topic.
Wow.
It's appropriate treatments. And I don't know about you, but I like inappropriate treatments. And I want to use treatments that my clients don't like. And I want to never listen to the stakeholders.
Right. I don't think you need to bother with is researching whether those treatments are effective.
You're right. I should just make them up on the fly. I should probably focus on punishment as opposed to reinforcement. Yeah. Jackie, what do you think? Sounds good? Thumbs
I
up?
love that. Oh, yeah, totally.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, sometimes...
Hang on.
Wait a minute.
What's this? I just found this.
What's
in
that?
Your bag, Rob.
Oh, I use that as a doorstop. It's nothing.
No, this is your ethics code for behavior
What?
analysts. I think maybe you should be using this instead of just doing willy-nilly whatever it is that you want to.
I don't want to. That sounds hard.
Look how many rules there are in here to follow.
But I read that
guidelines.
once. I read it once. It was very confusing. I didn't understand it. If only there were a book of multiple examples of real-world scenarios in which I could actually practice all the stuff I had to read. Wait, what? What's this? Why there is
Your other doorstop.
My other doorstop. It's a workbook of ethical case scenarios and applied behavior analysis. Oh, wait a minute. This reminds me of something. I remember this is by Darren Sush, Najdowski.
Mhm.
Feel like we talked about this once.
I
Maybe
think we did. I think
like
maybe it was
100 episodes ago.
Episode 105.
Oh, boy.
It's coming to me as we are talking about
It's
this
probably
now.
time
Yep.
for an update. If only there was someone who could help update us on ethical case scenarios and using ethics, especially with this new code. Is there anyone here who could help us with that? Hello? Anyone?
Hey, hi. Hey, everybody.
Oh my goodness.
I just happen to be here, creepily listening in.
Yes.
Special guest, Dr. Darren Sush, returning for an episode, another ethics mailbag. How exciting and unprepared for. Wow.
The acting in this is stellar. I mean, award season, look out.
Oh, you know, I tell my supervisees, no matter what you want to do in life, if you never got to be a Hollywood actor, you're going to get plenty of opportunities in your trainings and your role plays. So, you know, just keep at it. Darren, thank you. You know, I'm going to pull back the curtain, everyone. That was a little play that I wrote there for the start of the episode. But we are going to get
He didn't
serious.
tell anyone else about it.
No, it's an
also.
improv.
Yeah, it was improv.
I need a place that I'm practicing ethics. But we are very fortunate to have Dr. Darren Sush on the show again. I was not lying. It has been almost 100 episodes since our last ethics mailbag. And Darren, we're excited to have you on because not only are you a font of information, a font, one of those two, about ethics, but because we have in our little hands the second edition of your and Dr. Najdowski's Workbook of Ethical Case Scenarios. So we're very happy to have you on here to talk about preparing the book, and then we're going to do some ethical scenarios, kind of like we did last time. So welcome. How have you been?
I've been great. Thanks for having me back on again. Can't believe it's been 100 episodes since the last time. A lot has happened in 100 episodes all over the world and all over the place. So I really appreciate you having me back.
Oh yeah, it is. It was. I remember that being just so much fun when we talked about the scenarios. I know, you know. Let's focus on positive things that have happened in the past 100 episodes. I know in my own practice, I have used the original ethical case scenario, the first edition. I've used that as all part of all my supervision trainings. I believe my supervisees all love doing the scenarios and talking about the scenarios. They have not said otherwise. Perhaps they're scared to, but they seem happy when we're talking about them. I've just found using it and going back to it, it's just really sort of helped my own ethics game, you know, and I don't know, you know, if you all got a chance to talk before the BACB put out the new ethics code, but I felt like many of the updates in the new code really captured a lot of the lessons I'd learned from the last time we talked and the way that you'd presented the scenarios in the book. So I don't know if that was on purpose, if it was accidental, if it was an homage to the book. I don't know.
I don't know how much influence anything that the book had in the new code. I know they were really great about getting feedback from different BCBAs and really listening to the field and listening to the changes in the environment and just the evolution that we've gone through as practicing behavior analysts. And I felt a lot of that was reflected in the code. I mean, looking at the new edition, and one thing that was great is that they put out the new version of the code about a year or so before it actually went into effect, which let us all have a great amount of time to digest, get used to it, try to think about, for me, different scenarios that might apply to the code, but also how we might integrate this new code into our practice and use it as a tool. But one thing that I was really impressed was that the code really looked like the field. I really felt like a lot of the updates that they inputted into the code, a lot of the changes in the language, a lot of the changes in the content area really reflected a lot of the discussions that me and my friends were having as far as what we were hoping we would do as a profession, the challenges that we were having. So there was a lot of guidance that I felt was included within the code that maybe not necessarily it wasn't that it wasn't there before, but there was a lot of maybe a little bit more ambiguity where I think they solidified some areas. And is it done? No, I think there'll probably be plenty of new versions of the code, but I think this is a great start to listening to the field and growing.
Even more ethics. Oh my goodness. So many ethics.
So many syllabi to rework.
I know.
Exactly.
I did appreciate when they mentioned that we won't have like a complete overhaul of the code again. Now it'll just be revision. It won't be like, remember we had this code, now we have these guidelines and they're named differently and they have different colors on them. I think we'll keep the code for a while because it's less concrete, which is more helpful.
Looking over the different code elements and items, I mean, I felt it was specific enough that if I had a situation, I might be able to find those details within the code, but then open enough where, I mean, there's no way that the BACB is going to be able to capture every single circumstance that we're ever going to face practicing, or because the field is far too wide-reaching, and there's just so many scenarios that no matter how creative Adele and I are, we're never going to think of enough scenarios to capture everything that you're going to come in contact with in the field. So the code can't cover everything, but I feel like it's open enough that you can utilize the code as a resource, even if it doesn't specifically apply.
I mean, I certainly appreciated so much how, from our last conversation, how the new code looked at ethics as a process rather than here are the rules that you should not break. And if you do, oh boy, that's not going to be good. It definitely made ethics feel like what we've talked about and what I know you promote in the book, and that what so many professionals have been publishing on, that ethics is an exercise that you're always engaging in and you're always thinking about. And it felt less about the punitive nature of ethics and more the benefits of following ethical practice and critically thinking about problems that you may or may not run into but could in the future, and really planning ahead. So I appreciate that. I think we all like it when our rules are things that we aspire to rather than are scared of. So I'm a little less scared of ethics than I used to be. I will say in the past 100 episodes, it's less terrifying. So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, sometimes it's easier when there's a clear right or wrong answer, right? This is exactly what you should be doing. This is exactly what you shouldn't be doing. It's restrictive, but it also is a little bit comforting because you don't have to think about it. But most of the scenarios and situations that we find ourselves in behavior analysis, especially in behavior analysis and practice, but even in other fields that we might engage in, you're not going to find that clear-cut circumstance. Plus, and one of the things I felt was actually really great about this edition of the code is that you're facing that scenario based on your own learning history, your own context, as well as the learning histories and the circumstances and situations of all those other individuals that are involved. So we have to be flexible, we have to be adaptive, and we have to understand what might be influencing the behaviors of the individuals who are involved right now. And if we think too black and white, then we're going to miss the mark, and we're likely not going to find a circumstance that really promotes, for lack of a better term, the good behavior of everyone involved. One of the things I talk about a lot is, I really hate ethics is in black and white. And then one of the things everybody loves to say is like, hey, the gray areas of ethics. And well, this is a gray area and we really need to think about it. But I stopped doing that. I used to do that all the time. And I would make Counting Crows references, and gray is my favorite color, and all that kind of thing. But I stopped using gray area as my analogy, because sometimes what happens when people start talking about gray area is they kind of give up. So it's, well, this is gray, we're not going to really come up with an answer, so let's just do anything, right? Or they might say, well, this is a little bit ambiguous, so let's just find whatever the closest that we can do, and kind of, we're never going to kind of find the solution. But what do we do in behavior analysis, right? We understand the circumstances of the context that lead to behaviors, and we understand when behaviors are more or less likely to occur and what situations might influence that. So we don't work with the gray, we add the color, right? We make it technicolor. So that's what I always like to think of in terms of ethics is, how do we add color to this situation? How do we bring a better understanding, whether it's an ethical scenario that fits nicely with the code, or just a circumstance that we're in clinically?
It's very true. So, Darren, when looking at getting ready for the second edition, I mean, what were the kind of your main goals to accomplish in the second edition? Because, I mean, we all like the first edition. You got like 86 great scenarios. It's a great way to practice. It's a great way for students. I mean, other than, I guess there's a new code, so we probably have to update. I mean, I guess you didn't have to. I mean, you could have been like, just change the titles of the chapters and call it a day. Right?
Well, that was part of it. I'm not going to lie. I mean, part of the reason, and I guess one of the biggest motivation was, oh, wow, there's a new code, and I don't know how much my some of the chapters I wrote are maybe not so applicable anymore. And if I want to still have a book that's going to be useful to people, we better start thinking about how we update this. It was actually really nice, beyond the fact that I think the code did a great job in covering what we do within the field, but it was really great motivation for Adele and I to get cracking on writing a new edition. I think, the second that we hit save and sent in the first edition for publication, there was a flood of, but what about this one? But what about this situation? What about this scenario? And people would come up to me like, oh, you'll never guess what happened to me. And then other people would say, that same thing happened to me and me and me and me. So these weren't, these outlandish, really out there situations. So really, from writing the first, we were already in line or in mind to, we're going to need to come up with more. We're going to need to continue to work on this, because just as the field is evolving, just as the code is evolving, these scenarios are going to continue to evolve. So we're going to need to be on top of it if we want to continue to be of use to the field in this capacity.
Yeah, I think when we get to the mailbag section, I tried to pick a couple topics that we could discuss that seemed fresh, or that seemed like we hadn't really ever discussed them before, or they were ethical scenarios that 5 years ago we might not have recognized as ethical scenarios. But were there any sort of specific topics that you said, you and Adele said, like, we have to include blank because this is so like relevant to the now in a way that it might not have been at the first edition?
Yeah. So one of the things that I try to think about a lot is, where are we now in the field, and how do we view behavior analysts from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And a lot of kind of, especially the first several classes in any ethics course, you start to learn about the history, and maybe not the not so great history of the field of behavior analysis, and certainly of psychology, and a lot of the, to put it lightly, missteps, but just what we would call blatant ethical infractions and injustices and harm that we've caused as a field. So in thinking and thinking retrospectively and reflectively on the past, I also try to think kind of proactively, and okay, what's hindsight going to look like 10 years from now? What are people going to look at the field that we're thinking we're doing everything right? We're promoting our science, promoting our practice. We're assisting the individuals that we hope to fulfill with a more fulfilling life. But what are they going to look at us and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe they thought this was a good idea? So that's kind of where I was hoping to capture, and Adele and I were hoping to capture a lot of the areas in this workbook. And the nice thing, again, is that the code kind of reflects a lot of this too already. So one of the things that we definitely wanted to include was issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the previous code kind of hinted at that, if you will. I mean, you can certainly apply the code to issues of discrimination and harassment, but it wasn't as blatant. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure to do was include, unfortunately, very real world scenarios that happen on a daily basis, again, unfortunately, within the practice of behavior analysis related to cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, inclusion of individuals from different socioeconomic statuses, and receiving appropriate competence and training in those areas. Within that, we really wanted to make sure that we were reflecting issues related to neurodiversity, and that we were being fair to the populations that we say we want to help, and that we were making sure that we are creating and establishing ethical scenarios that would not just maybe even plant the seed within providers or future providers who would read those scenarios to say, oh, this is something I really need to keep an eye on, but maybe turn the mirror back on themselves a little bit about how they could be better practitioners. And of course, we were writing this, within the last year or two. So of course, we're in the midst of COVID and health crises. And I will forever be grateful to the field of behavior analysis for how we kind of managed within all the changes that happened in a very short time. Behavior Analysis in Practice released their special issue with guidance, then updated those issues as we learned more information, and we could no longer use those original articles because just we had to evolve. So we wanted to make sure to include health-related issues within these scenarios, telehealth issues. Telehealth has been around, obviously, for a long time, but not to the degree, and people had to kind of figure it out pretty quickly and figure out whether they would be good at it or not pretty quickly. So we wanted to create some scenarios that centered around that as well.
Did you have like a favorite update that you whether it's a scenario or a formatting choice or something you did and you're like, yes, that's it. That's why you make a second edition.
It's hard to say a favorite because, when you work on a project like this, you love it and hate it at the same time. So my favorite could also be my least favorite because it also meant if there was a big change, it was a lot of work. So that stinks. But a couple things that we did differently this time around is we changed the format of how you would complete the workbook. So before we had similar discussion questions to what we have now, but they were kind of open-ended with kind of a blank box at the bottom where you can kind of fill in what you wanted to fill in. We structured that a lot differently in the second edition to help people who are using the book to, if they were, fans of the paper and pencil and they wanted to use the book and like a true workbook and write in it, it would be a lot more guided, but also allowed for that open-ended, just free thought of what's the scenario, what's related. So that was really, really fun and interesting because that also caused us, when we were thinking of these scenarios, to really think about, okay, what would this look like in practice? What would this look like if we were, in a study group with some friends and just chatting ethics as we do for fun on a Friday night? just me? Okay, great. So that was one change. The other change, we really tried to listen to the feedback that we got from people who had the first edition or used the first edition in their coursework. And one of the biggest things that we heard was they really liked that there wasn't suggestions of what codes might be related, and then at the same time did not like that there was not suggestions. And one, because sometimes you just felt like you were getting it wrong. If well, wait a minute, am I missing something? It's maybe there's something under this rock in a code that I'm missing, or what do they want me to think here? And that's kind of one of the reasons why we didn't include it in the first place, is we wanted to allow for that discussion. We really didn't want people to feel pigeonholed into what our opinions were for what code elements might be related, and we wanted to give them the opportunity to think a little bit more freely. But the louder voices were really saying we could use at least some guidance of what your guess is or what you're thinking, being that we wrote it. So that's another thing that I do like that we changed. It's in the back of the book. So there's a little bit of response effort of having to find where it is. And of course, there's the disclaimer that we have of, there might be stuff that we missed, or there might be elements that, we think this applies based on, how we're thinking about the scenario, but, allow yourself to continue to think beyond just, the couple codes that we mentioned.
Yeah.
Do you have to hold it up to the mirror to read it?
Not an invisible ink or anything in the back. You need the decoder.
Like Highlights magazine, you like hold it up like, backwards.
There was something involving heat and lemon juice, and then you had to go dig in the desert, I think, a little bit. But once you get past all that, it's really easy.
All the answers are all right there.
Exactly, yeah, that's all right there. You have to hold up an egg in the back of a convenience store. You're fine.
I know I really loved the streamlined nature of the new edition. And again, I'm about to say a bunch of positive things. So full disclosure, we got our own, I think, first edition. We all loved our first editions. So, you were in the publisher, were kind enough to send us a second edition. So I just want to say that. But we have used the original one a ton. So again, it's not like we've never heard of this book and then we're like, oh, whatever.
It held the door open great. Too.
Held the door open great, yeah. So but I do believe this praise is genuine from my own usage of the first edition and looking at the second edition. But just to be fully transparent, I love the streamlined nature because the first edition had like 86 scenarios. This one has 123. And when I picked up the second edition, it was so much lighter. Like, it's physically lighter than the first edition. I was like, oh man, they must have just like scrimped on these, or like get the first. We added like 2 more scenarios. But I think it was the streamlined nature of each scenario gets its own page. And it kept, I think, all the things that were really useful in that first edition in terms of the guided questions, sort of allowing one to think through their ethical decision-making process rather than where's the violation? Like, tell us where the problem is. And, in terms of just what's applicable, is there or is there not a violation? Do you even know? What are the steps? And then usually kind of the one, extra guiding question of like, what if in this scenario, the person wasn't a BCBA, or it's kind of something variation on the theme featured, which was great. I loved a little bit of the open-endedness for that question. What are the applicable codes? Because I found when I think of applicable codes and then narrow down to violations or possible violations, I find it really lets me just think very broad, like cast a really big net. But I know now it's more like specific individual boxes for the applicable codes. Was there any worry like, oh, but if we put boxes, people will think there's like, that's the number of codes and don't think of any more, but you have to think of this many? Or was that sort of, part of that process of, what does that visual look like?
It was, and part of it is just a spacing issue because, people have to fit the book in a backpack, right?
Yeah.
Or on their shelf. Although it would be good promotion if it was this gigantic book that people were carrying around, I suppose, it's walking billboard. But part of the concern was if you create a box, essentially, then people might feel like they have to limit themselves to the box. So we did try to make sure that those questions, even if they were included in a box format, that they were left fairly open-ended, and you had that opportunity to certainly either add more in writing or in thought. One of the points that you made, which I love, which is, being able to use these scenarios now in practice in classes and in discussions. Our tendency, especially when you start thinking about ethics and you start referencing the code, is violation or no violation, right? That's where everyone kind of goes first is, well, wait, where's the violation here? And something doesn't have to be an ethical pure violation in order for there to be a learning opportunity or for there to be a problem. And in fact, most scenarios that we find ourselves in that are challenging, they're not going to rise to the level of a violation. They're going to be things that certainly could if they progress and continue, but they're just going to be challenges. They're going to be issues. So one of the things I often talk about is before we start thinking about is there a violation or not, let's just start thinking about, do any of these codes relate? Is there anything that raises an eyebrow within this scenario that relates to a code, and why do you think there's a relationship here?
Couple other things that I know I loved. You had some updated research that you were discussing in terms of like because we've seen some publications. Was there any sort of like recent ethical research that you like wanted to shout out as like that one really was like a game changer in terms of how we were thinking of scenarios, or just was a kind of crystallized a lot of your own thoughts about ethics or your own sort of process in learning ethics?
Yeah, a little bit. So one of the things that we tried to think about it, because there's been a lot more discussion about ethical decision-making models. So I think when we were first writing the workbook, there was some suggestions of, there's no definitive decision-making model. We were borrowing a lot from particularly the American Psychological Association and the models that they'd established or counseling work. And so there wasn't really a lot related to how should we be thinking about ethics or guidance in that way. And again, I don't think that there's one model that we should follow, but since writing the first book, a number more articles have come out related to just decision making and then responses to those articles. So there was so again, it just points to the fact that, it's okay to think about this. It's okay to have debate, as long as the direction you're going is creating additional harm. But so there was the Rosenberg and Schwartz article. There's a lot of critiques of that article. I think it's a really great article to at least think about when you're making an ethical decision, or when you're in a scenario that might be problematic or precarious, or even you think you're doing everything right, thinking about the context of that circumstance. Why do you think you're doing everything right? What is it about you and what is it about them that's giving you the indication that you have the green light? And then I know Tyra Sellers, Jim Carr, and Melissa Nozick came out with, they had a response to that article, and then Matt Broadhead also had a response to that article.
I really loved it when I saw basically it's the BACB response to the shows, when I the Rosenberg and Shores article. I was like, ooh, the BACB is specifically responding. I mean, it was a nice response, but it really was like, you have to think about the BACB here and what our purview is when they responded there. But I was just, when I saw it, I was like, ooh, here it comes.
Well, it's like the official word, right?
Yeah.
So, well, one of the things I really liked about their response to the article, because they didn't negate really anything that was said in the Rosenberg. If anything, they said, yes, please do this. This is what we've been saying for forever. But one of the critiques from the Rosenberg and Schwartz article was, if we think about ethics as this rule, this steadfast rule, then how do we apply it across scenarios that don't perfectly fit that rule? And frankly, the only way to do that would be to have 1,000 different codes, which is not possible. And even then, you're not gonna cover everything. So one of the things I liked from the BACB's article was kind of defining what it is that the code's supposed to be for us, and how we can use it as an assistive tool versus this thing that's kind of hanging over us, watching over our shoulders, and you better not do that or else you're going to be in violation. But more, hey, if you follow these practices, things are probably going to work out pretty well for you and for your client.
It's very true. So many good things. Looking back as you were editing it, Darren, I always want to ask this because I feel like sometimes when I'll read, like we did a Nudge for one of our book clubs, a sort of behavioral economics book, and the author spent a long time in their last edition talking about the process of making the edition, which was kind of cute and then kind of got annoying after a while. But when you were looking through the first edition, were there any scenarios or statements, or even just thoughts you had about this is, I bet, how everyone will answer this scenario, that in retrospect you were like, oh, why did I ever think that? That's not how it is, or I want to rewrite part of the scenario because it just doesn't feel as true as I thought it did back then.
Mm-hmm. Everything was perfect. No, no, I think, some of the things that we certainly needed to rewrite because the codes just were no longer applicable to the scenario anymore, right. Or, from feedback that we got from the individuals who had been utilizing the book, they might have been keying in on aspects that I never even thought of. One of the things that's really interesting about kind of being able to kind of use the book in action and, not having a front row seat to kind of the thing that we put out there is, students or just people who I talk to, they will identify areas of the scenario that, in thinking about it, I never even thought that it would be, something to focus in on or key in on, or they'll identify codes that they feel relate in ways that I never really even thought of when I was writing it. And it shows how kind of blinders you can have when you're working on the project, but how those different perspectives can really be useful, and different ways of kind of utilizing the code, and how different experiences really can guide, what it is that we do.
I make a lot of case scenarios for class, and I can attest to how difficult it is to really make a good scenario, because you don't want to lead them so much that the answer is just sitting right there, right? But sometimes if you make it too open-ended, then they don't, hit on the right part of the topic that you're trying to help them grow in. So it is really a fine line of trying to give just enough information that they have the direction, but not too much. So you did a great job.
That was a really hard thing, actually, because there's this one, especially when you're writing it, to kind of tie everything up in a nice bow, or make it very clear, and this is the bad thing they did, right, or because of this action, they then, were stricken and thrown out of their company. So having some type of conclusion, and there's some scenarios that are like that where it's really blatant, kind of what went wrong and what the repercussions are going to be. But then there's a couple scenarios where it's like, this is what happened, and then it's like an ellipses, and then, so it requires the person who's utilizing the scenario to talk about, okay, well, what might be the consequences of these actions? So how do we now have to create different contingency plans dependent on these consequences? Or, hey, this is the mess we're in if we're pretending we're this person in the scenario. What are we going to do? Maybe not to get ourselves out of it, but as a response to this, in order to be fair to the client, be fair to ourselves, be fair to the learner, and try to protect for any further escalation.
So before we get into some scenarios, we'll take a little break and do that. I did want to say a couple more positive things. I know we talked a lot in the last episode about the titles. Every case scenario gets a funny title. I don't know how you thought of like 40 more titles, but I was comparing my first and second edition. So I think these were new ones, but I just wanted to say they're ones that jumped out and I really loved them. So maybe they were old and I missed them the first time, or they were the new ones. But case 2, Licensed to Ill.
Yep.
I don't know if you meant that to be a Beastie Boys reference or not, but that's how I took it. Okay, good. I was good. Case 31, Just Not Into You. I think that is a fabulous phrase to use in all situations. 34, check yourself before you wreck yourself. An expression that I think I haven't heard in public as much as we should. We should be using that every day.
It's very applicable to ethics.
It is really. Case 63, Can You Hear Me Now? You know, that's a classic. Again, another phrase. I feel like I just love the ones that are phrases that are old and make me happy and nostalgic. Oh, no. And then case 64, I think very of the moment, zooming into treatment. You know, very, very of the time we live in. Yes, but very good. I don't know how you guys come up with those, or if you have a big whiteboard and you just like write them down as you go. And you're like, someday that'll be an ethics scenario. I don't know.
Well, you need to toss yourself little nuggets of reinforcement here and there.
That's right.
And this was the thing that kept us going. And sometimes it was like, we're not really going to name it this. This will just be the placeholder until finally it was like, no, this is the way it's going to be.
That's the one.
That's how our episodes get named sometimes too.
So that's why they're named 4 different things in all our different files too. It's great. The only feedback I have in terms of updates, I know we've talked about doing the choose your own adventure, like a video game version of ethics. So, you know, that would be great. You know, just as a thought, I would think a nice edit in your case example. You're talking, you know, of like how to use the book. You're talking about what could people do in the future to improve, to avoid a scenario. And you mentioned, you know, well, you could do more professional development, listen to podcasts. If you want to put in like parentheses, i.e. ABA Inside Track, you know, we're fine with that. We sign off. You have permission. You could do EG if you want. Like maybe there are some other podcasts they could be listening to too. You know, that's fine. But, you know, just a thought for the future.
I am taking that note.
Okay,
right.
good.
He's making it into a scenario. What do you do when someone tells you they want to shout out in your book?
I know, a common problem for everyone when authors won't shout out your podcast in their book. I know. It's a real human drama. All right, so now that we've learned all about the making of the second edition of the Workbook of Ethical Case Scenarios, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, mailbag time. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Darren Sush about a workbook of ethical case scenarios, or more specifically, we're going to get into some ethical case scenarios. But before we do that, I want to remind all of you listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. And by listening to this episode, you're able to earn an ethics learning credit. And if it's like our last ethics mailbag, I think we might get into the 1.5 range with this one. I got to look at the final code, the final time code, but it's going to be 1 or 1.5, but it's ethics no matter what. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs, GET-CEUS, and enter in the code words for this episode, which we've hidden throughout. I've hidden the first one right here, and I'm about to tell it to you. The first code word is breakin, BREAKIN, with an apostrophe. If you put a G because you're more formal, that's fine. It's supposed to be breakin', though, in honor of the great 80s breakdancing movie, Breakin'. Nobody expected it to make a ton of money, but it did, and it was super cheap to make. So that is our first code word, breakin'. And now let's get into those ethical scenarios. All right, so let's dive in. And I forget why we decided we call this ethics mailbag way back when, but I guess it's the sequel, so we have to call it the same thing again. Because there's scenarios. We're going to have ethics scenarios or something. I don't know.
It's a mailbag. It's like people sent in all the ethics letters to you, and then you pull them out, and you pick some to read.
Okay. But that didn't
Like on
really
Blue's
happen,
Clues.
though. I forget why. Okay, like on Blue's Clues.
Rob, obviously Diana created the title of this one because she
Okay,
remembers.
there we go. Now we know.
I guess I did. It makes sense to me.
All right. So to talk about cases, like we did last time, we went through the code, we went through, the book, and I thought I picked a few that kind of just a quick sample from each code. There's their 5 codes and then the complex code case. Tried to pick ones that I thought would be sort of the moment, they're relevant. We also had one from the first edition and the one that's a classic update that we talked about in the last episode to see is it that different with the new code? And the answer is not super different, but there's new
Don't steal Jackie's
new
thunder.
code. I don't want to steal Jackie's thunder.
It's okay. My thunder is miles away.
Muted. All right, so the first code. So this is a case that relates to code 1, and it's called "How Different Can It Be?" And this is a scenario that I'm sure you all will know from the past 2 years. So Cameron's a BCBA working for an ABA agency and is facing a state-implemented mandatory lockdown due to a current health crisis. Which health crisis? We don't know.
It could be any health crisis.
You have to leave it open.
Who knows? If people are reading this 10 years from now, they're like, health crisis, eh?
Okay.
What would that be like? So Cameron, again, he's an experienced, BCBA. He's supervised lots of face-to-face ABA services, but he's never used telehealth, this new technology of telehealth. But his concern for his clients is that without continued ABA services, a lot of the learners on his caseload will demonstrate regression. And so even though telehealth is something that's pretty new to him, he decides everyone's doing telehealth. Everyone's going to be doing telehealth services. Everyone's got to get the ABA services through telehealth, and that's just how it's got to be because of our current health crisis. All right, so that is our scenario.
Hey, Rob.
Yeah.
One thing you should note, too, is that the word code, this is from the BACB podcast as well, the word code is from the old ethics code, and now they call them sections and standards.
Oh, yeah, and I wrote it in my notes as code too.
It's okay.
That's it. Well, if that's the only ethical mistake I make, then I will be pretty happy with my career. So, all right. So section. So this is kind of related to section 1. So again, I always love looking at the applicable codes. And, full disclosure, I did not look at the suggested potential answers until after I'd already done all the work here. I did not cheat, which would not be ethical, although I don't know how harmful it would be, I suppose. So again, when we're talking about this is a problem a lot of BCBAs ran into, right? So we're talking about, 103, that accountability, the fact that, Cameron already had a number of cases. So the services were agreed upon. I will provide ABA services to these families, to these clients. But the big issue is going to be 105. Is Cameron practicing within his scope of competence when using telehealth versus in-person services? Now, one might say, well, depending on what year this case took place in, we might, give Cameron a little bit of a pass in that some of the work related to is telehealth or practicing through telehealth actually a competence? We've since seen a number of articles. So, Linda LeBlanc's article about telehealth being its own set of competence. So, if this were 2000, 12, perhaps it wouldn't be as big of an issue, but we have seen there's definitive research around this. So practicing within the scope of competence, telehealth is a competence level, and it's one that Cameron is clearly not stating that he is competent in. This also relates to codes, other codes like, is he providing effective treatment? How did he involve clients and stakeholders? Are the needs the same in the lockdown as they were before? And again, a lot of this is sort of, what articles have I been reading for the past 2 years like the rest of us? How has he been designing or implementing these interventions? He doesn't know how to do it over telehealth. So again, leading back to 105. I think another one that came up in a lot of the articles I read was, what about minimizing risk? 215. There are new risks to families suddenly dealing with, I can't leave my house, than there were when it was like, Billy's still learning some simple mans and, really doesn't like it when you take away the iPad, right? It's very different when it's mom and dad or caregiver versus highly trained professionals in the center base where they used to do services. Certainly applicable codes relating to, is Cameron addressing conditions that interfere with service delivery? Is he maintaining that responsibility to clients? They have the right to services. However, that doesn't mean they have to be presented immediately through telehealth. Also, if Cameron were to say, can't do it, sorry, don't know telehealth, how would that be in terms of like 312, advocating for the right appropriate services for the child? They might actually need more services now that they're all trapped in home. I think, we saw that and we heard that from a lot of practitioners and a lot of families. And then, of course, the codes, the sections relating to how do you discontinue services? If Cameron decides, I can't do telehealth, someone else needs to do telehealth, how would you transition those services, especially in a lockdown where it might be difficult to get a hold of those, or those services are suddenly on overload, the folks who are competent in telehealth. So those are codes that I thought were applicable. And when it comes down to the violation, yes. I guess one could say maybe not quite, because it's not, maybe the services haven't quite started yet, but it sounds like Cameron made the decision already. So the code relating to a section related to 105, practicing within scope of competence would be the area in which there is a violation. So any thoughts on that one? Or, how did it sound like I did, everybody? Am I on the right track?
No, I think, and this is one of the great things that I really appreciate about kind of going through not just the code, right? I think one of the things that we fall into when we're talking about or learning about ethics is we read the code and then we try to think, oh, well, how might this apply? And inevitably, we're going to come up short. Or if we try to just translate the code into understandable language, we'll get a better understanding of it. But, we're not going to have really a full in-depth use of the code. So, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to come up with the scenario book in the first place, is to try to kind of backward fix this, right? So, it's really interesting. A lot of the codes that you came up with, if you looked in the back of the book and you did kind of check it out beforehand, really the only code that I mentioned as the primary code, or that we mentioned as the primary code, is 105. This element serves me is practicing within the scope of competence. I'm going to do that a lot. I apologize, because the competence is really the central issue here. Is Cameron capable? Does he have the skill set? Has he had the training to implement services through this medium? And if not, might this affect the accuracy, the depth, the appropriateness of his services? And could there be a potential risk of harm? Things that come to mind are, now who's responsible for actually making sure that the programs or the lessons that you're putting in place are going to be followed through with? If you have individuals who maybe engage in more severe, persistent behaviors targeted for reduction, like aggression or self-injurious behavior, when you have a staff member there who's trained to hopefully implement proactive strategies to reduce the likelihood of that happening, well, the risk involved there and the appropriateness of implementing programs in that area is a lot different than if you're saying, hey, parent, caregiver, whomever's home, we're going to keep doing the same stuff. So good luck with that, right? So it goes well, 105, practicing within scope of competence, is certainly the overarching issue, but all those other elements that you mentioned, as far as potentially terminating services or delivering appropriate services, identifying barriers to services, this is why I feel like the code is such a useful element in appropriate treatment, because these are the things that a practitioner should be thinking about, even if it's not a quote unquote violation, but this is just good ethical care is good clinical care. So, might he continue to work with these individuals even though he has no practice in telehealth? Well, he'd have to weigh the pros and cons or the risks and benefit. What's worse, not having services or doing services via telehealth? And then if the choice is, okay, I'm going to do services via telehealth, your job's not done even though you've kind of satisfied this one element. Now it's, what's next? Do I need to get supervision? Do I need to bring in anybody to help and mentor me? Do I need to adjust the treatment plans that I was previously going to do so that they can be implemented in an appropriate way via telehealth? Do I need to maybe scale back dependent on the person that I'm working with, or scale up in certain areas because now, we're just on a screen versus face to face? So the code doesn't stop with violation or not violation, and it doesn't stop with, here's the one thing that's appropriate or applicable. It creates kind of a learning opportunity and an idea of what to do next that's going to hopefully be best outcome.
Certainly your book, Darren, is that it captures all of that. Because I know, like, when I was a grad student and we do ethical scenarios or someone would have an ethical problem, you'd get to the part of like violation, no violation, violation. It's this one. High fives all around. We did it, everybody. We identified the problem. And it's like, well, I mean, who cares? Like, it's good that there was a problem, but it doesn't fix anything or help anything, help the field, help the client, help the practitioner. If you're sort of just like, yep, you did something wrong, shrug, guess that's it. You have to then talk about what led to this decision so we can avoid it in the future. What are the immediate actions that have to be taken now to minimize or mitigate any harm that's been done?
And getting going back to the thought of like black and white, right? Getting rid of the thought that, okay, Cameron's potentially engaging in something that could result in a violation, right? Depending on how serious that violation is. Okay, because someone's engaged in an ethical violation, does that mean now he's bad, right? Oh, Cameron's a bad BCBA. He's misrepresenting the field. We now need to shun him and send him out to walk the plank, right? That's not the appropriate step. What's contributing to his decision making here, and is it for the best interest of the client? He just might not be making the best decisions. Would it be helpful to have some guidance to maybe make some more worthwhile changes?
Yeah, certainly for this one, I think, this is a real scenario in the sense of like, what are the antecedent factors? And I'm trying to think of them. I'm like, I guess very few of us were around during the 1918 like flu pandemic. So did any of us ever think, well, I might need to switch to telehealth at a moment's notice due to some sort of like global catastrophe? I mean, not really. I mean, the only global catastrophe I ever thought of would be, zombie apocalypse, right? But like, we're not worried about our services in zombie apocalypse. You'll do them after the zombie apocalypse. This was very...
Or you won't. I'm going to be dead. I've already...
You might be dead. That. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I read the zombie survival guide, so I know what to do. I'll be fine.
Just leave me behind.
I'll leave you behind. quick, eat my wife. I'm out of here. So, not knowing about telehealth, I mean, it was one of those things of, I'm sure a lot of people said, oh, telehealth, that sounds interesting. I'll read about it later, but I don't need to do that because I'm going to drive to my client's house right now and see them in person. And certainly, I hope that cases like this and scenarios like this that some of us lived through, some of us just heard about, looking forward, we found that supervisor, we found that mentor in the short term, kind of like you were mentioning, Darren, we found someone who could help us make sure we do the services. What's the risk assessment that they would recommend before just going in, doing exactly what we were doing in person over telehealth? And then in the future, Cameron's company maybe taking a look at, okay, what are the other crises that might occur and how are we going to determine appropriate levels of services, what considerations? At the very least, apologizing and communicating regularly with the families about like, I don't know how to do this. I'm deciding this is important, but let's talk about some possible risks and work together to identify if they're happening and then make change. You might need to change that behavior plan of like, oh, the token system we had worked wonders, might not work wonders for the caregivers right now. So maybe we need to just, here's their period of time where they get all the things that they love. We're going to, even though we weren't on that, that's the plan we're going to go back to. It's just that communication with both someone who knows what they're doing to help mentor Cameron, but then also, constantly with the family about assessing, is this still working? Is this what we want to do? It would be some kind of easy first steps. And then in the future, kind of moving along, maybe transition to another professional, but, again, that has its own list harms.
This is such a, real example, obviously. And I think it's also a good one in that a lot of people were put in this position without this background. And like you said, Darren, it doesn't make them bad people or bad BCBAs, right? Because the choice was between try to provide services as best you can or leave families without any help at all. And that is also against the ethics code as well, and potentially, could cause harm to families too. So I agree with you. I loved that I do feel like our community rallied together to try to get information out as quickly as we could, like call for papers from BAP, and like they just, push them out as quickly as possible. For our little part, what we did is we had Dr. Delia Espinoza on, who had just handled, from her perspective, the lockdown in Italy that had been going for 2 weeks, and we had her come on and talk about how they were trying to deliver remote services there. And that episode is downloaded, I don't even know, like so
at least
so many
once,
times.
we know.
And it's still being downloaded, honestly. So it was a group effort, I think, to try to get people as much information and like crash course experience as they could so that they could operate within the ethical boundaries as quickly as possible. It was a tough situation.
Yeah.
Bit of a gray area. Just kidding.
All right. So let's move on to our next case, which comes out of Section 2. Even though I'm looking at the word code in my notes, it says I'm changing to Section 2, Jackie. So Diana, you wanted to discuss this one, and I did read. Is this the one in your notes where you wrote this case?
No, that's my other one.
That's another one. Okay. One of these cases, Diana said, thinking about this case made me so angry, which is scary because she doesn't get angry that often. So if Diana says she's angry, you better watch out. But not this one. This one made you happy.
It's also maybe I'm not
less angry.
I'm not an unethical person, but just I'm not an ethicist, right? Like this isn't my strong suit because I think I do just get angry, and then I say, well, why don't people just already do what they're supposed to do? But this is case number 50, and it was titled Identity First. And I'll read you the scenario. It says, Elton participates in ABA services with Janelle, a BCBA. Although he has repeatedly told the members of his ABA team that he prefers to be referred to as autistic rather than a person with autism, Janelle and her team continue to introduce Elton using person-first language. Elton's behavior plan includes quote-unquote stereotypical behaviors as a target for reduction. Elton has discussed with his team that he understands he may engage in some finger-pointing behavior, particularly when he is having difficulty with school assignments, but does not believe the behavior is an issue for concern. Elton's plan lists the behavior under the heading problem behaviors, along with quote-unquote non-compliance and vocal protest. I believe it's the finger pointing is the topography of the stereotypic behavior. Do I have that right?
Right.
Okay, got it. Very good.
I didn't know if it was like this.
I didn't know if it was like meaning like accusatory, right?
Yeah.
Like.
Oh no, this was just
topographically.
Like hand
yes,
movements.
Okay, that's what made sense within the rest of the scenario. I was just making sure. All right.
It's like 12 Angry Men
Not
over here.
not like
Right.
yeah. I'll take that note.
So the
third edition.
Sorry. The applicable, what is it? Standard? Section. Sorry, with Section 2, responsibility and practice. And I just limited my code searching within that section, which I see now was insufficient, but that's what I did. So
you know what? We all got to start somewhere, Don.
I know, right? I'm going to be dead soon from the zombie apocalypse anyway. Yeah. But I identified 4 important codes from within that section, and they were 2.01, providing effective treatment, so prioritizing the client's wants and needs in service delivery. 2.09, involving clients and stakeholders. That means make appropriate efforts to involve the clients in selecting goals and designing interventions. And then 2.14, selecting, designing, and implementing interventions. And 2.15, minimizing risk of behavior change interventions. I thought all of those seemed very topical to this topic. This seems to me to be of the moment, and in a good way, though. Like, I want it to be of the moment from now on. Mm-hmm. Because we should be always thinking about these issues that are brought up here. What is our client's preferred language surrounding the diagnosis and how they see their identity and their position on what they think are appropriate targets for their programs. We should always be considering that. So the fact that Elton's, brought this up and his team, even though he's able to tell them what it is that he prefers, are not listening to him and are, using language that's outdated, is not his preference. And at this point, we have, a fair amount of literature on discussion surrounding opinions from the autistic community on alternatives, right? the fact that Janelle is continuing in this process without that or listening to that input, to me, would be a violation of, most of those codes that I just mentioned. So prioritizing the client's wants and needs, making efforts to involve them in planning. And I also think minimizing the risk of behavior, minimizing the risk of the interventions that you're proposing, because this is not something that he sees as necessary. Some of the behaviors that are being targeted and then the language that's being used, I think, could also be quite harmful for him. Antecedent factors, this one is important too, right? Because everyone is coming from their own history and background. And if you've been around for a while, then you probably were trained in the way that Janelle also seems to have been trained, right? In the way that she's sort of approaching the situation. There's like a lot to say, I guess. So how you're trained is how you're trained, but that doesn't mean that you can't continue to learn, grow, and adapt. From that perspective, there's a lot to uncover here and talk about if you haven't ever, taken the time to look into thinking about, neurodiverse populations, talking about ableism within our field and the effect that can have on the interventions that we're providing, taking a minute to identify practices within our field that are going to fit within the medical model of treatment versus understanding the social model of disability. All of those pieces are wrapped up in how Janelle's responding to the situation, and she could, do a lot probably to seek out some more information on those topics. It's readily available and out there, and maybe expand a little bit on her thinking in order to be providing Elton with the type of intervention that's going to be most beneficial to him and what's actually useful for him, as well as providing him with the respect and dignity that he deserves. Preventative strategies would be get out there, get some education, maybe company-wide education could be useful for Janelle and for everyone else, right? You only know as much as you know, but you can always do better from what you did in the past. And that's okay to, come and speak from a place of humility and say, I've updated my thinking, but everyone's got to, have a chance to learn that. And people are at different places there. And then on the individual level, certainly asking Elton what he wants, although he's made it clear, but then ensuring that you're going to include him and his preferences in treatment planning moving forward. What do you think?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think, I'm a lot like you in that when I was participating in my training, particularly at my training as a psychologist, it was hammered home that if we're going to be talking about the people that we work with or that we hope to work with, it's person first language. And that's the way you demonstrate respect. That's the way you help to build independence and autonomy. And that's the way you show empathy towards the people you're working with is just, person with schizophrenia, individual with depression, person diagnosed with autism. That was a very strong component of the training that I received. And it was meant to be a way of not limiting a person by their quote unquote disability, right? As a way of kind of and doing so the other way was seen as insulting, or at least was taught that this was insulting. And I understand that. I understand that perspective, and I understand kind of the heart behind that. But years have gone by, and one of the biggest mistakes that we can make is this is the way it's been done, so this is the way we should continue doing it, right? And if we want to work across populations, particularly with the autistic community, then it really is our responsibility to listen to those individuals that we're hoping to be a part of, because we're joining that community by and hopefully in support, right? So part of that means if they're telling us, right, if the individuals that we're working with are telling us this is our preference, and especially if there's no harm or there's no risk, and they're letting us know kind of this is why we believe this is important, then that's our job, that's our responsibility, and that's their right to be treated as such, right? So if we have in this scenario, Janelle is saying, I prefer to be identified as an autistic individual versus a person with autism, then it might be uncomfortable because it might go against, again, our training, but sometimes it's okay to be uncomfortable. And then the question to ask for Elton to ask themselves is, why am I having a hard time switching this? Or why am I not switching this?
Elton's the autistic.
Oh, I switched it up. They're fake people. I made them up anyway. Janelle is the BCBA, excuse me. But why is Janelle having the challenge, swishing up the verbiage? Is it a comfort thing, right? So is it that, we kind of fall into the language that we're used to, and it might just be a motivation to self-correct? Or is there something more of like why she feels it's inappropriate to follow the request of the person of the learner that she's working with? And I think that will likely lead to a lot of answers for her of kind of what to do from here. In the description of the scenario, it talks about stereotypical behavior. One of the things we were thinking of changing that is just self-stimulatory behavior, because that even hammers the point home even more about, well, we all engage in self-stimulatory behaviors of some sort. Twirl your hair, tap your feet, crack your knuckles, whatever it might be. Why are we holding the people that we might work with to a greater account than we might hold ourselves? And how interfering, how problematic, how necessary is it to target these behaviors? And these are questions that, just because that's behaviors we used to target because they were quote unquote wrong or bad or quote unquote problem behaviors, is that the way we need to continue to do so? And if we feel like that's the case, again, why? Why do we feel like that's the case? Mm-hmm. And I think part of being kind of allies for the neurodiversity movement isn't just saying, everything the individuals we work with say is right, and everything that we were thinking before is wrong. I don't think that's the ask. I think it's, still providing support and guidance where we fit, but making sure that we're listening to how we do that.
Very, very true.
Totally.
Very good. It's a good scenario, everybody. All right. Let's move on to section 3. So, Jackie, this is your case. It's case 71, called Stay in My Lane.
So it's actually kind of hilarious. I didn't put together that you did them by sections, and I didn't see on the bottom that it said section 3, responsibility to clients and stakeholders. So I'm that student that went through all of them. I was like, okay, what could be applicable here? But luckily for me, right, so my scenario, Miriam is a BCBA. She works in the home. She's been working with a student for about a year. That student also receives additional services through the school district in the form of OT and speech, and has a district BCBA and a paraprofessional. Miriam knows about the classroom arrangement, knows about OT and speech, has said, hey, I'll go to some IEP meetings. But because she only oversees the home programming, she hasn't attempted to contact anyone at the school to get more information or collaborate, and she hasn't approached the family for release of information to do that. So that was mine. And ultimately, when we're looking at the different codes or different section and standards, right now, because she hasn't reached out and hasn't asked permission, right? It's not a violation per se, but it could be, right? So I think that's what I would say, is that there's a lot of related things, and depending how treatment progresses both at home and school, there could potentially be a violation if collaboration isn't happening. So I said that the big take-homes are responsibility to clients, right? Because it is her responsibility to act in the best interest of her client and know what's going on at these other places, right? But then I also thought it was really important, because this is a newer code, 2.10, collaborating with colleagues, right? That we're supposed to be collaborating with our colleagues. So that's why I was like, oh, it's this one. And then I was like, no, it's section 3. So it's responsibility to clients. But I think both of them are important, right? Because she does have some purview in that she should be collaborating with these other clients. I'm glad that she hasn't collaborated and consulted with them without asking parent permission, right? So I think this happens a lot, right? I think home BCBAs are hesitant to reach out to school districts a lot because of the different settings. So the antecedent factors, I think that, there isn't always a ton of collaboration between home and school. And so I think her first step would be to talk to the parents and ask them if they would like her to consult and collaborate with the school district and those services. If the parents say no, she should absolutely not collaborate with them, right? Because it is the parents' right to do that. I think she absolutely could ask, right? The school district also may not want to collaborate with her. right? And in those situations, what she can do is report what she's doing at the home and then, give the parents her report, and then they can share it with the school district. The school district can read it or not. But I think the biggest risks are, looking at 2.10, effective treatment, collaboration with assessment and intervention, right? Those assessment intervention may be compromised if her treatment programs are vastly different than what is happening at school, right? And if they don't mix. So that could be the problem there. And then your discussion question, I love this discussion question. It says, do Marianne's ethical obligations differ since Xavier received support from another BCBA? I don't think so, right? We all have our own ethical obligations. She has her own obligations.
Yeah, the thumbs up.
And we also don't know if the school BCBA knows she exists.
Yep.
Right? We don't know that.
I appreciate all that. And one of the things I appreciate that you mentioned is that you kind of had to look at different sections of the code or different sections of the code in order to find kind of things that were applicable. And one of the things I think they did really well in this newest update is they organized things a little bit differently, and where there was kind of repeated code elements, they kind of conglomerated everything into one code, so you didn't have to kind of flip back and forth all over. But that's not to say that there's still not going to be maybe some codes that seem to maybe go back and forth on each other or relate to scenarios, because if we're applying this in real life, we're going to have to take a bigger and broader view of how we use the code. And I think, even in this scenario, there's a lot of things that went right? It's not like she didn't give out any information about this individual without permission.
Right.
And that does happen a lot, where families might say, you know what, I don't want anybody else knowing that you're receiving services, because maybe it's a funding issue, maybe it's, just a safety of information issue or what have you. So that she hasn't reached out without getting that informed consent first or getting that release of information first.
Right.
Good. I mean, she made a good decision there, but she might also be selling herself short if she does get that permission, because, those are services provided by somebody else. Why do I need to know about that? There are different settings, school's different. And if you think about generalization and maintenance and just progress within your own treatment, isn't it best practice to know, are these other practitioners, whether they be BCBAs, OTs, speech therapists, what have you, are they implementing strategies that might be helpful for me to know about, or might actually be hindering the things that I'm working on? And we're just coming from such different directions that maybe that's making it so what I'm doing just doesn't seem as good anymore. So I think the code you mentioned, collaborating with colleagues, is fantastic. I also think the code element that you mentioned, consulting with other providers, is essential here. And I think that's something that I think a lot of providers who I speak to get worried about. It's saying, well, wait a minute, it's a different funding source or it's a different environment. Am I even, is it okay for me? I don't want to step on toes. Should I be, working with them? Shouldn't I just be, I guess that's why I call it stay in my lane. Should I just be staying in my own lane, right? Should I just be doing what I'm doing and keeping my head down? And in some cases that might be appropriate, but it also could be to the detriment because of maybe our own insecurities in working with others.
Yes,
So luckily for me, I get the next one as well.
Oh, yay.
Section 4.
All right, so this is a classic update from the original edition.
Yeah.
Bringing it into the second edition.
And for me, I think what I'm going to do here is this one's going to be a tiny bit shorter, because we've already talked about it in our previous episode. But what I can say is that the Supervising Bcba, this is all about supervision, right? More people want to have her supervised than she has time for, right? She's feeling stressed. She lets the director know. The director's like, no, it'll be fine. More people are going to graduate and then they can help you, but that doesn't help right now, right? So that's basically what happens. And there really wasn't, I don't think, a lot of additional codes here. There was just renaming, right? It used to be it used to be 5, standard 5, and now it's code 4 or section standard 4, right? So I don't think there was a lot here that was different, but maybe
this
I don't
Kamiko,
know.
If anyone remembers from the last episode. Kamiko.
Yes. Yeah, and one of the updates that they made to the code or the section here is that I'm going to do it. I'm going to keep doing that. Is in the last version of the code when it was talking about supervision, it was clinical supervision as well as kind of training supervision, if you want to call it that. And one of the things I actually appreciate is this code now really does relate to that training supervision, and the clinical elements are interspersed throughout the other sections. But this scenario really does look at just there's too many things to do and not enough time to do it. So, it's almost like the jack of all trades, master of none. So are you really able to dedicate your time effectively to all these different responsibilities, or is Kimiko able to dedicate her time to all these different responsibilities that she's been given? And even though it's for the betterment of the field, right? We want to train new BCBAs. We want to get people excited about using ABA strategies and interventions. We want people to become, leaders in the field themselves. But if you're not giving them effective education, support, and training, then are you setting themselves up for success, and are you leading by example? So that, I think that remains. And I think one of the things that we talked about last time was, in this case scenario, it's pretty obvious she is legitimately being spread too thin and can't take on these. But again, that might not be the end all be all. The one responsibility is to look at, well, are we actually managing all these responsibilities effectively? And can we maybe reprioritize or look at how we're doing all these different tasks differently?
One of the things that is increasingly coming out, and I think you even mentioned in some of the introductory texts in your book, Darren, and in some of the research is just how much time the supervision takes, and how so many of the ethical violations, I can't remember which of the surveys, but or which of the released information of the BACB, but one of the top ethical violations that goes into the BACB has to do with supervision. And I think it's because so many of us in the field, like when we were supervised, it was very different than the supervision now. It was sort of like, just get these forms signed and chat about how the week went. And, you work on some stuff together, and there you go. You're a BCBA now.
Yeah.
Whereas,
and that's one thing. And then it's 5% of RBT's time too.
I know, and now it's just it's like a time dedication. And, it's even one of the kind of the bonus questions of what does Kimiko do if her boss is not a BCBA? It's like, well, this all sounds good. This is good for my bottom line of my company. We need more BCBAs, so you're going to supervise them all. And if that individual is not a BCBA, it might be harder for them to understand the amount of work that's going to go into supervision. It's like, I can't just make this time appear. There's a percentage of time these people need to spend with me. They have to be doing relevant activities. It can't just be like, well, just watch them when they're, doing trials with the kids, and that should do it. You do that hours and hours a day. It's like, that's not good supervision after the first couple hours, because there's so many other tasks that BCBA has to do. It's not the same as RBT supervision. And I know, depending on your organization, they may or may not value that. It may just be something that sounds good in practice, but when you talk about the actual resource drain, to some extent it can be on your company, like, nah, I don't really like that. Just say you did it, and that level, is his own level of challenge. Yeah. Supervision, it's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work.
Time.
Yeah.
It's going to take a whole lot of precious time. It's going to take patience and time.
And it'll take spended money if you're,
to do it right.
To
do it right. Exactly. Yeah.
If you got your mind set on supervision.
That's right.
Of course. That was
Darren
fun.
has nothing to add to
I
that.
appreciated
that. Oh, good.
Okay, now it's my turn. I'm going to talk about case number 102, which is
102, folks. Darren, congrats. You got into the 100, the triple-digit cases.
All right.
I'd get to about 20 cases and be like, in this one, they use a bad service, or in this one, they don't like reinforcers. I'd be running out of ideas very fast. So kudos.
As per your example.
That's
this was in section 5, and this example was actually from the first edition, but we didn't talk about it, and it's a real goodie. So I'm going to review it now, and it was titled Internet Troll.
This made you angry.
This one made me angry.
It's in the notes, folks. Yes, this whole scenario makes me angry.
So here's the scenario. Jen is a BCBA and is a member of several ABA groups on Facebook. He recently came across a group moderated by Chris, who provided her full name and stated that she's a BCBA. Chris describes the Facebook group as the water cooler for BCBAs looking to vent about their jobs and their clients. Scrolling through the group, Jen noted that Chris posts a lot about her frustration with parents and teachers. Though Chris does not specifically identify the names of the learners to whom she provides services, she often calls them by derogatory names. Jen noticed that a few others who identified themselves as BCBAs also posted links on the page and made similar negative comments about their cases. OMG. G. Okay. So this was underneath the section 5, like I said, which is responsibility in public statements. And there were several codes here that seemed applicable. 5.01, protecting the rights of clients and stakeholders in public statements. 5.02, confidentiality in public statements. 5.10, social media channels and websites. And 5.11, digital content in public statements all seemed relevant to me. And then the rest of my notes really are just me saying that I'm angry about this scenario because it makes me super mad. So no one should ever be talking about their clients anywhere near the internet. This is I don't know if it's a public forum, right? But regardless, you can get into those types of groups even if you think that they're private. So that is not a reason to say anything derogatory about your clients on the internet. Either way, also these folks are like, clearly identifying themselves as BCBA. So in doing so, they're, representing being a BCBA and are behaving in a way that is definitely unprofessional and just absolutely should not be occurring. This is true on and off the internet to me. I know that this section's about public statements. So, the same is true if you're out in the community, right? And you're at dinner with your friend, you should not be talking about how hard your day was or what a challenging time you had with your student, because you have no idea who's sitting in the booth behind you, right? None of that is, behaving with respect towards your client. And it really just should not be happening at all.
Well, I think you could say you had a hard day, but you want to
had a hard day.
Take a page from the ACT book, and the thoughts you're about to say about like, oh, my client's driving me nuts. Step back. I have a thought. I have a feeling, and realize, you know what? The value I want is helpful services to my client, and I might just be mad because I didn't feel I was providing those services. That's what I tend to do when I start getting a little peeved in a situation. I'm not mad at my client. I'm mad at a situation that I feel I'm not doing what I want to be doing, which is helping.
Yeah. Well, I think it's okay to be frustrated in the work that we do. I mean, the work that we do can be very, very taxing and very stressful. Of course, very rewarding as well, but also really hard. And, it's not all unicorns and rainbows, and being able to feel comfortable vetting and venting and not feeling like you're a bad person because you had some troubling feelings related to the work that you do, it is important in kind of being able to figure out what the next steps are going to be. But the way in which you vent, right? That's the challenge, especially in this scenario, and what purpose is this serving, right? So is this to anybody's benefit but the person who's posting it? And as you mentioned, anybody can get into these groups and they live on forever. And this is one of the cautionary tale scenarios, I guess you can say. And one that when people read it, a lot of people say, well, that never happens. Nobody would do that. And I was like, well, open up Facebook right now and go to go to a group. I get you can do 5 seconds of searching and find something like this. And we know, and you hear about news stories from other fields all the time of people, losing their jobs, or families whose child read a post that they are pretty sure is about them. And what does that do for our image as a field? What does that do for what we say our mission statement is as providers? It's all sorts of bad.
Yeah. Yeah, you were calmer about it than me, so that was good.
Dana, read your preventative strategies statement. I felt that really...
It just says, take an ethics class. I'm sorry. But, and sometimes you'll see people on the internet who are also, sort of, they are presenting a challenging situation, but they're trying to be relatively neutral about it. But the internet is not the place to be getting advice, clinical advice in the first place, right? And then in the second place, you can, click on that person's name. It takes you 2 clicks to find out where they work. And it would be really easy for someone who, knew them to then surmise what student they're talking about on the internet, which again breaks a lot of confidentiality rules, even if the things that they're saying aren't, actively derogatory. It's still just not okay. It's not a good idea.
And that perception too of, if they say, oh, Robert Perry Cruz is writing these things, you don't need to be able to prove in a court, like, I think he was talking, there's enough evidence to say he was talking about this client. You just need to know my name, search a little bit about me, where I work. And you could say, hey, that's enough for me to feel like you were talking about this client. It's not going to matter. It's like, no, you can't prove it. Who cares? That becomes irrelevant in that situation, because it's about that, that perception is going to be the damaging, one of the damaging parts of that.
So I think Jen could reach out to her, right? Say this isn't okay to put on the internet as a first step.
I'd be curious to see how the response to that PM goes.
I don't know.
But you're right. That would be the first step.
That seems to me like the first step of that process. But to me, it's pretty clear violation. So if it were to continue, I think he would probably need to continue to respond.
Yeah. I wonder even if, hey, Jen PMs Chris says, oh my God, you're right. I wasn't thinking about it. I put this together when I was just so angry and so frustrated with my last job or whatever. You might not be able to take down some of those things. Or what if somebody snapshotted it or took a picture? You might close the group, but it's going to be somewhere. Nothing's ever really gone on the internet.
Yeah.
All right. And finally, we're coming up to our last case for the mailbag, and this is the complex code. And I want to stretch my ethics muscles, so you guys will have to tell me how I'm doing. A complex case from the back, which is all the codes. And of course, as we've been talking about, you could talk about a lot of the codes in the other ones too. It's not a requirement that just because we're talking about section 1, you can only use section 1. But, for people who are new to ethical scenarios, it gives you a little bit more focus. But in this one, all bets are off. Could be anything in the code. It's case 113, chosen name. So we have Bennett, who's a BCBA overseeing a group program for teens diagnosed with ASD. Dylan is a member of the group and was born female and identifies as male. Dylan has indicated a preference for using they, them pronouns. All the records and available paperwork for Dylan list Dylan's gender as female and include Dylan's birth name, which is Dara. Since greetings and other social skills are practiced within the group, Bennett says, well, Dylan, why don't you use your birth name, and you should probably use she, her pronouns too, because the other members might need help. This is, maybe it's a new, not what they're used to, perhaps. And then whenever Dylan uses their chosen name, Bennett corrects, quote unquote, corrects Dylan, which, Darren, I don't know what you meant by correct, but it gave me a creepy vibe. I was a little nervous reading this one. And if another member of the group greets Dylan using the name Dara, the member is praised by Bennett. So that's seen as that's the behavior to increase, is using the name that Dylan has asked not be the referent name for them. So when we look at applicable codes there, applicable sections, we look at 107. So, cultural responsiveness and, diversity. It's important for us to have an awareness of our own biases, our ability to address the needs of our transgender client, in this case, Dylan. 108, a non-discrimination, in this case, for gender expression. So making sure that we are not discriminating our clients based, and we're treating them in an equitable and inclusive manner. I don't know how you can be less inclusive than everyone in the group is going to be specifically taught and reinforced to go against your specific and well advocated for wishes. I wasn't sure about 109 non-harassment, but it did feel like, certainly the corrects in quotes, Darren, that felt so creepy that I was like, this does feel like it's, if not harassment, it's definitely bordering on harassment, of just consistently know the thing, I don't know what Dylan's experience has been, in terms of identifying a different name than a birth name, advocating for pronouns, but it potentially has been, a really tough, road to hoe for Dylan, and to have someone be like, nah, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to make sure everyone else doesn't do it too. That just feels like beyond the pale of sort of just like, well, I'm a little nervous because legally your name is that, that it feels like it goes beyond that. So I did feel it was applicable, if potentially not exactly a violation. 110, awareness of personal biases and challenges. Is Bennett really doing this to help the group? I get it. Oh, well, it's, a group of autistic individuals. Maybe they're having a hard time with, the different pronouns, or they've only been taught that, he looks like this and she looks like that. And that's going to confuse them and, could blow some minds. And I want to be cognizant of that. Oh, yeah. Okay. I hear where you're coming from, but are you sure that this isn't something that you have chosen to do based on your background? Certainly 209, involving clients and stakeholders. Dylan is very clear about what they would like to get out of this group, and it is not necessarily happening. in this case. I thought kind of maybe 214 looking at, designing behavior change interventions. Again, the interventions, I can't see how good of a social skills group this is when clear statements related to just greetings, related to talking about activities, every single one of those potentially is going to be, doing some harm to Dylan in terms of just hearing the wrong name over and over and being told to stop engaging in the use of their chosen pronouns and their chosen name. Certainly looking at 301, what's the responsibility to clients? That is the right of the client to choose pronouns, to express gender however they feel. And it is just clearly not happening. Potentially even to the point of 215, there's a risk. All of a sudden, we think of social skills groups as being sort of like, well, that's a low risk. We're just teaching people to say hi and to share and to have conversations and to appropriately join a conversation. And suddenly it feels like there's a weird risk being thrown into these interactions. So again, maybe not risk in the way I think we think of risk of our treatments, but I don't know, the whole thing just felt like it took this very hopefully pleasant and productive group and turned it into just a very, somewhat harassing or hey, maybe let's just say harassing environment. So yeah, I mean, definitely violations here just in terms of, looking at the cultural responsiveness and diversity. So 107, looking at the discrimination, 108, potentially harassment, 109. I mean, again, that could be debatable, but I mean, do we want to have that debate? We could stop where we are and say, let's fix this scenario. And then certainly involving your clients, 209, involving your client and stakeholders. So the whole thing, and I don't know, Darren, for this one, I don't know if it's just a matter of, the idea of working with transgender individuals, whether that is just new for some clinicians and whether you've just been hearing horror stories of individuals who just aren't really thinking about their own biases. And it's just, well, that's what's on the documentation. So legally I gotta do it. I'm not sure what, if that's was in the thought process of this scenario or.
Well, to me, it seemed like a very real world circumstance. And I suppose fortunately you don't hear specific situations like this in the ABA world a lot. Although I think the reality is me not hearing about something certainly doesn't mean that it's not in existence. And I think here we have a situation where it's a teen group, probably with a primary focus on interaction, social skills, social interaction. So being able to communicate your wants and needs, advocate for yourself, work with other individuals. I mean, those I would assume would be some of the main objectives of being involved in a program such as that. And here you have Dylan, who's pretty effectively identifying for themselves. Here's how I'd like to be known. Here's, they're expressing their wants and needs and advocating for themselves in as best a way as I could expect anybody to do. And essentially what we're doing, or what Bennett is doing in this case, is stamping down that skill development, right? And I agree, we can't read the mind of this fake person who I made up of knowing kind of what's motivating that, personal biases or nervousness that you're not following the program as is initially identified, and I'm not skilled enough to adapt and adjust my programs to something that I'm just not used to or know what to do with. But I think that also builds to, well, then are you the individual to be independently supervising this group? Right? Are your biases hindering your effective intervention? And are you able to be of support to this individual and provide effective treatment? Or are your biases getting in the way of that? And if they are, then might that mean having additional providers be of support or potentially even referrals? That opens the door for a number of other ethics conflicts, right? But you're weighing what's the challenge here and what's going to be best for the individuals involved in that group. And in Dylan's case, constantly being told, no, we're going to dead name you. And we're not going to go by the name that you're stating you prefer or deserve to be called. We're not going to follow the pronouns because maybe it's harder or because I just don't believe in it. Are we being effective clinicians, or is this person being an effective clinician here?
I think one of the antecedent factors that I would probably, if someone told me that, I'd be like, oh, okay, I guess I get. I wouldn't condone the behavior of Bennett, but I might say, oh, yeah, that it would be potentially if Dylan's caregivers, are not in support of the change in pronouns. Because while Dylan is the client, if your stakeholders are paying you and are very clear, like, nope, that is the name. I think Dylan's confused or Dara's confused. And I think, right. She needs to understand that this is a phase. And that could become a conflict. Again, not that would, I wouldn't mean that well, then therefore this isn't an ethical violation, but I can see how that would add the wrinkle to, Bennett's ability to provide services or, how to advocate appropriately for Dylan.
I think that brings up an excellent point, because if that's maybe part of what's contributing to Bennett's uncomfortability here is maybe the parental preference or caregiver's preference, and frankly, the parents, given that Dylan here is a teen, can't legally give consent for the services, but we might be looking at issues related to assent, right? So this is the service that they're participating in, and while they might not be able to legally say yes or no, this is what I'm agreeing to, we also know that the services we're delivering are going to be that much more effective if we're providing opportunities for feedback, providing opportunities to be involved in the services, providing opportunity to give their opinion and have that integrated in as much as possible. I think, again, it goes down to, if we just say what Ben is doing is wrong, therefore stop, then we lose a learning opportunity for ourselves as people reading the scenario. Mm-hmm. But if we say, okay, what might be contributing to the demonstration of this behavior that I blatantly, even if you blatantly don't agree with it, then you learn more about maybe how to appropriately manage the situation from a more ethical and appropriate perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think there were a couple scenarios where it did feel like the number one step in your ethical course of action was apologize profusely to your client about, I really should have been listening to what you said. That wasn't okay of me. I will be doing that going forward, So you have to hope that if you do it early enough, maybe the harm won't be so bad that, Dylan will, all right, I'll give your group another chance, right? But also looking at future risk factors, looking at some preventative strategies, in addition to the self-reflection, some further professional development, it may be worth getting, hey, do you have like a consultant, focuses on cultural humility or cultural competence that can maybe look at the policies you have to ensure that you have everything set up, that your programs are set up to be inclusive. Hey, maybe part of the new script, you want to update your social skill training script and introductory script. Maybe you get all the students discussing the idea of, it's okay to share, or maybe you should share out your pronouns with folks, because that's a good, inclusive way to make sure everyone feels like that's something they can share. They're not like the other, like, well, if you want to share your pronouns, you can. It's like, well, then if everyone just makes it kind of a part of the routine, it's, it's all kind of our agreed upon normal, rather than, that's an other. They have different pronouns, so they'll tell you what they are. You can tell my pronouns from my, visual. That's not inclusive. So maybe it's a learning opportunity for all the participants in the group. All right, so that's it. We've gone through our scenarios. We have some good ethical discussion, and the nice thing is, even if you listen to this episode and the last episode, you still got like over 115 or so scenarios to go. So we're going to do them all right now. No, I'm kidding. We have a lot. That's a sampling of what is in the book. So Darren, any kind of last things you want to mention about, the case scenarios, about, the ethics updates, about, where people can find the book, all that stuff?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. It's always fun to get to talk to you all and talk about these scenarios. And, I learned so much more just talking about this. So it's always one of my really interesting and favorite things to do, is just to talk about this, because even though I've been in this for and especially these scenarios so long, it's great to have the opportunity to talk about it and learn even more. So thank you for that. As far as where to find the book, you can find it on Amazon. So if you search my name, or if you search a workbook of ethical case scenarios and applied behavior analysis, then you'll see probably the first and the second edition. The second edition includes the new code. So that was there available for you. Also from the Elsevier website. So you should be able to find that on that site as well.
Excellent. So no dissemination station today, unless you want to do the train sound, Jackie, just because, we talked about all of ethics. There's not much to disseminate other than it's good to practice ethics, everybody. And if you're looking for a great way to not think of your own scenarios for the millionth time and come up with the same boring ones that I might come up with, hey, you've got over 100 ready to go right here. And I know I love this book. I use it in all my group supervision meetings. We make ethics a big part of it. And having these scenarios to pull from, I think have given my supervisees just a lot to think about. That, again, it's not just the same, like, what if you did this terrible thing? You're a good person, bad person scenarios, which I'm still not great at making scenarios. So thank you. We'll let the pros handle it. Darren, you can keep making more scenarios. We love them.
Sounds good.
Once more, a big thanks to Dr. Darren Sush for coming on the show and for providing us with a copy of the second edition of a workbook of ethical case scenarios in applied behavior analysis. Again, that was co-written by Dr. Sush and Dr. Najdowski, Dr. Najdowski, both of whom have been on the show. We're very excited to have such illustrious guests, in addition to so many of our other guests. I was not blowing smoke, everybody. I do use this book regularly. I have enjoyed reading, not like reading it page to page, certainly, but I've enjoyed reading the different scenarios, talking through ethics. And if it's not something that you're regularly doing as a part of your work in your company or with your supervisees, strongly, strongly recommend it. You don't get better at ethics unless you are doing it every day and always keeping it in mind and focusing less on the good versus bad sort of paradigm that I know I came to ethics thinking about. And if you've been listening to this podcast since day one, you'll know my attitude towards ethics and my dislike of the black and white nature of things has shifted over time. And I will say that, a lot of our research and our conversations with guests has been a huge part of it, this book as well. So definitely you can certainly pick the book up on Amazon. Like Dr. Darren said, you go to Amazon, you go to your local bookshop, all those places, the Elsevier site, to pick up a copy if you are so inclined. And hopefully you are after listening to our discussion. I want to make sure everyone gets our last secret code word. It is crow, C-R-O-W. It's that, like the black bird. It says caw, caw. Also, you could be thinking of the band Counting Crows. Remember them? They had a bunch of hits. I don't know if they're still around or anything, but, a lot of good songs. One of Diana's favorite songs by Counting Crows. Which one is it? You'll have to ask her. Crow. Once again, big thanks to Dr. Darren Sush for coming on the show. Thanks to Diana and to Jackie. Thanks to all of you as well for listening to ABA Inside Track. We'd love it if you subscribed on your favorite podcast player of choice and liked and left a review, all that good stuff. We really appreciate it. A lot of other places you can find us online. We're on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of the articles or to, in this case, the book that we discussed in the episode, as well as to find places to purchase CEs and a list of all of our previous episodes sorted by kind of categories of interest. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, we invite you to join us on Patreon, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get access to all of our episodes a week ahead of time, as well as access to some bonus video content, some Q&As with researchers, live episodes, a chance to vote on a topic every single season, and discounts in the CE store. And if you want another podcast on top of this, we do a seasonal book club for our $10 and up subscribers. By the time you get this, we will be in the process of recording our next book club voted on by patrons. We'll be reading The Nurture Effect by Anthony Biglin, all about how behavioral science can save the world. Previous topics we've done include the memoir, Look Me in the Eye, and the behavioral economics book, Nudge. And again, that's available on our Patreon site, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. All right. I want to also thank some of the people who make this show possible. Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturrier for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!